Thank you. I think we'll start now. If you could take your seats, and we'll begin with this second session. We're going to be discussing the rules, norms, and principles in the context of international ICT, peace, and security. Welcome and thank you. My name is Andras, and I have a pleasure to moderating this panel today. The panel will deliberate how can the international community build on past successes of the OEWG and GG, the pair of UN processes dedicated to advancing international ICT, peace, and security. And we'll also try to investigate what should be prioritized in the coming years, perhaps particularly in the context of the 21-25 OEWG. On the subject of rules, norms, and principles, past successes mustn't be neglected. And please allow me to give just a very brief 5 minutes overview of what has been agreed and which things are still were still left on the table. In a consensus resolution 70/2037, the General Assembly called upon member states to be guided by their use of ICTs by the 2015 report of the GG. I'm pretty sure we all know that by now. And more precisely, by the 11 voluntary non-binding norms of responsible state behavior. Accordingly, states are now expected to cooperate in developing and applying measures to increase stability in their use of ICTs, including in their efforts to prosecute terrorist and criminal use of ICTs. They are also expected to be wary of attribution challenges and take into consideration and making sure that the responses to cyber operations are of non-escalatory nature. States should not knowingly allow their territory to be used for internationally wrongful acts using ICTs, should strive to ensure supply chain security, and encourage responsible reporting of vulnerabilities. Interestingly, several norms were specifically related to the critical infrastructure, indicated the importance of the international peace and security of these infrastructures. In this context, states agreed to protect their own critical infrastructure, B, to consider helping other states whose critical infrastructure is being targeted by a cyber operation, and to avoid targeting or knowingly supporting targeting of foreign critical infrastructure, as well as certs by means of cyber operations. This year, in 2021, the GG produced an additional layer of understanding to these norms, underscoring their value with regard to the expected behavior of states. I don't want to elaborate more on that, but it has been quite a feat, and the report is full of very interesting read. But moving on to the 2021 consensus report of the OEWG, which restated the limits of the norms. Again, they're not supposed to replay or alter states' obligations or rights under the existing international law. It should not really be interpreted as a limit or prohibition of conduct that is otherwise considered to be in compliance with international law. But substantially, the 2021 OEWG report emphasizes the importance of, again, critical infrastructure, integrity of supply chain, and responsible vulnerability disclosures. On the topic of critical infrastructure, OEWG reiterated the need for compliance with international law, as well as the importance of protecting healthcare through the implementation of the norms healthcare institutions for healthcare infrastructure. OEWG also recommended states take reasonable steps to ensure the integrity of supply chain, and dedicated special attention to the responsible reporting, again, of vulnerabilities and the need to prevent the proliferation of malicious ICT techniques and tools. This is not to say that the work on norms is done by any means, and many questions, as we all know, remain. In light of that, the OEWG concluded that additional norms could, in fact, continue to be developed over time, together with the parallel process of implementing them. Indeed, the mandate of the 2021 OEWG or 2025 OEWG is to continue to further develop the rules, norms, and principles, including changing the existing norms or potentially even come up with the new ones. And that's something we're going to be exploring today. From the perspective of substance, past discussions indicated appetite for extended normative framework related to critical infrastructure, including the need for cooperating to protect critical infrastructure that provides services across the borders or jurisdictions in order to ensure general availability or integrity of the internet. Further normative discussions appear to be required also in the context of integrity of the supply chain and harmful hidden functions in ICT products. And during the OEWG, the past OEWG, some states even called for objective international rules and standards on supply chain security. Last but not least, some states urged the international community to engage in further discussions on the topic of stockpiling the vulnerabilities and the responsibility to notify users of significant vulnerabilities. In light of this, we'll try to explore today the norms that should perhaps be changed, norms that should perhaps be created, and the role of non-state actors in these endeavors. I understand that there's a close linkage here with the implementation of the norms and the need to operationalize the norms. And the OEWG and Chair's summary has spent quite a lot of time speaking about this as well, but the focus today is mostly about the norm setting, norm altering, and so on. I'm absolutely not qualified to answer any of these questions, but I'm delighted to be joined today by three distinguished speakers here to help us to explore the future of cyber norms. First, we have Ambassador Nathalie Jaarsma. She's the Ambassador at Large for Security Policy and Cyber from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Netherlands. Joining this panel from Australia is Ms. Joanna Weaver. Ms. Weaver is the Director of Tech Policy Design Center from the Australian National University and was a member of the 2019-21 GGE. Last but not least, I'm really glad to have Eric Wenger as well. He's a Senior Director for Government Affairs at Cisco. Thanks for joining us despite the very early hours in the US. I'll keep the suspense for a bit longer, if you don't mind. Before I give the floor to the speakers, allow me to remind the audience to submit the questions via the Slido platform. I think all the requirements have been already eloquently communicated, but this goes for both people present in the room today as well as our valued online audience. We'll be collecting questions during the debate already, so please feel free to submit them as they come to your mind. And after the initial discussion among the aforementioned speakers, we'll have about 20 minutes dedicated for questions and answers. I believe all these rules have been eloquently explained at the beginning already, but please be reminded this conference conducted under Chatham House rules. So I kindly ask to observe that. So whatever is said today may be attributed, but may be used but not attributed. And I hope this will be sort of a stimulation for an open and honest debate. Enough from me for now. I'd like to start with Ambassador Jaarsma. Given the past deliberations, do you believe that the 2021-2025 OEWG should be, in fact, changing the existing norms? And if so, are there any particular norms or areas of cybersecurity that should be further elaborated by the OEWG? And in line with that, perhaps what are the risks and benefits involved with this so-called evolutionary approach to cyber norms? Ambassador Jaarsma, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andras. And first of all, thank you and UNIDIR for your invitation to me on this panel. I'm really pleased to take part in a discussion on rules, norms, and principles of responsible state behavior just before the start of the first substantial open-ended working group session in only 1.5 weeks from now. And in our view, the latest open-ended working group and Group of Governmental Experts reports from an important milestone. They are substantively rich and politically balanced. They reconfirm a very solid acquis, and both reports include guidance on norms which are an essential part of the international community's efforts to prevent conflict. They set a standard for the behavior of states and allow the international community to assess the behavior of states. The new open-ended working group should by no means change the existing norms, we believe. I believe that the acquis should remain in place and the new open-ended working group should build upon that acquis. Such an evolutionary approach to cyber norms is essential in order to take into account the rapid technological developments that impact cyberspace. On particular norms that should be further elaborated, We believe that the new open-ended working group may further develop the practical guidance provided in the GGE report, and it contains suggestions for concrete policies and mechanisms at the national, regional, and global level that can help states to adhere to the norms. And for example, to further develop efficient mechanisms to exchange information on and request assistance in the event of an ICT incident, and to further enhance cooperation and decision-making on vulnerability disclosures to help curb their commercial distribution. And we believe these kind of mechanisms are essential for the actual implementation of the norms. And of course, we have been very vocal that implementation is needed based on the very solid acquis. Thank you. Back to you, Anders.
Thank you, Ambassador. That's quite a lot of things to consider. I've put things down. I'll ask questions at the end if you don't mind. But I'd like to give the opportunity also to Joanna and Eric to weigh in on this particular topic of changing perhaps the norms. This being the mandate also of the OEWG. Joanna, you want to step in first?
I'm happy to. Thank you also to UNIDIR for the opportunity to address this conference. It's wonderful to be in Geneva, if not in person. I think the first thing I would say about the OEWG resolution, the new OEWG resolution, is we have two consensus reports that have both been endorsed by the General Assembly, the GGE reports from 19 through to 21, and the OEWG report, all endorsed by consensus, which is a considerable milestone. Just to note, the resolution establishing the 5-year OEWG wasn't a consensus resolution, and of course we're all now committed to engaging in that GGE, but I think it is important in the context when we're talking about the mandate referring to amendments to existing norms to note that actually that was one of the reasons why a number of countries were unable to support and vote in favour of that resolution. The other thing I would say is that one thing in both the GGE and the OEWG processes, which was clear on every aspect of the geopolitical spectrum, was a commitment to keeping those norms as they were. And I think that only developed more and more over time as we realized just how precious those 11 norms were, because when we were looking at further negotiations and realizing how much of actually an incredible feat it was in 2015 to reach that agreement. And I think, you know, that was a widely held view from the Chinese to the Russians to the US to, you know, every country that was engaged in that process. So I think there is now a well-established commitment not to amend those norms, which is not to say that we won't talk more about what those norms mean, or maybe there might need to be more norms, which I'll talk about next in the next question. But I think this idea of changing those norms, we've realized that actually the extreme value of those norms as they are, we don't want to reopen that for risk of walking backwards. And the final thing I would say is when we're talking about the evolution of norms is there is also a lot to be said around also putting this in the context of deepening understandings with respect to international law. So as we are having this discussion, and particularly in the context of the GGE report, which added this extra layer of understanding, we absolutely need to keep doing that with respect to the norms, but it's also vital that we don't do that at the cost, you know, singly focused on those norms. We must also be doing that with respect to deepening understandings of the application of existing international law as well. Thank you.
Thanks. As much as I'd like to speak more about international law, I think this is the subject of the next panel, but I'll be tuning into that as well. Thank you. Eric, do you have anything on this particular question of changing the existing norms obviously from the private sector perspective?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to join you here today, and for UNIDIR for the invitation and for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel. I am not a cyber diplomat, and so I may step on some some landmines here, especially given the early hour in my time zone. So I'll beg of you that it is an excuse. But I would say that Cisco has joined a number of different initiatives in the past couple years, 3 to 5 years, that are focused on the idea of essentially agreements among private sector companies about things that we think are important. And at the same time, I think that they are intended to be a reflection of places where there need to be norms of behavior that are adopted by governments. I'm not saying that the norms that have been adopted are inadequate. I do think that that they are important. There are obviously some discrepancies between the points that have been adopted in the GGE and then some of them that have been pulled through or highlighted in the OEWG report. And I think that that is significant. I would say that in terms of evolving the norms and then operationalizing them, which is always important, that would be an area of focus to look at some of the places where there have been some things that I think maybe have been left on the table. In terms of things that we have joined, that we have recently rolled out something called the Trusted Cloud Principles. And I think at their heart, they are telling governments that we don't want to be put in the middle of conflicts of law between governments in a position where data is not able to flow freely, or where we are asked to do something in one legal system that would be prohibited in another. And then we are also a founding member of something called the Cyber Tech Accord. And in that space, we are saying that we're going to protect our customers by building security into our products or services, and we're not going to let down the protections, even if the things that we're seeing coming that are potentially going to attack our customers are coming from governments, even friendly governments. That our goal is to try to defend our customers and their security and their privacy. And so we need norms, and we have, I think, a good set of tools to work with that can be evolved to support these important goals so that we protect critical infrastructure and critical information systems, which have never been more important to enabling people to work and communicate and to learn as they have been in these challenging times. Our ability to sit around the virtual table today and have this conversation is completely reliant on these ICT systems and their importance has been clearly demonstrated. So those are the stakes that we're dealing with. And I think if I was going to point out one area of evolution, I'm happy to carry some of this over into the conversation about new norms. It's not clear to me whether or not you should consider some of these to be expansions or new norms, but that states should not condone or knowingly support ICT activity contrary to obligations of international law. That's what you have in the OEWG group now, in the report now. I would say that I would evolve that if I were in control of this process, which I'm obviously not, to avoid tolerating or condoning ICT activities that threaten these critical infrastructures. So we have, I think, a clear understanding of the importance of the critical infrastructure systems. There's a clear understanding that conducting or knowingly supporting these activities should not be allowed, but taking steps to make sure that if you're aware of activities that are originating from your territory or your country, that you have the opportunity to, not saying that anybody necessarily needs to be directly responsible for it, but if they're aware and there are steps that they can take that would allow for the protection of ICT systems that we're relying upon for these critical functions, that would be a way that I would think about evolving norms.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, probably there's a thin line sometimes between changing and creating new ones, but let us move into the next question, and perhaps we can explore this discrepancy or the delineation between two in detail later. So I'd like to start with you, Joanna, if you don't mind. Are there any gaps, significant gaps that currently, and I don't want you to be personally offended, but nonetheless, are there any significant gaps in the normative framework of the GG and OEWG that should be addressed by providing additional norms of responsible state behavior? And again, obviously, I must ask, what are the risks involved with this progressive development, if there are any, and what are the benefits? Thanks.
So I think just very briefly, I want to pick up on a point that was made by Eric about the differences between the GG and the OEWG report. And I would say those reports focus on different things. So the GGE report, for example, provides a lot more detail on additional layers of understanding on the norm implementation, which the OEWG report doesn't. But we took extreme care to ensure that neither of those reports were inconsistent. They focus on different things, but they're not, they sit and complement each other. And that was something that both the chair of the OEWG and the chair of the GGE was particularly careful, and also our members. I think in terms of do we need new norms, the question for me is always, where are the gaps? And frankly, I am yet to come across an example that is given to me by somebody where they think we need a new norm that can't actually be sat under an existing one of those norms. So for example, the example that Eric just gave then, I think that is absolutely right. This is not just about not damaging the critical infrastructure of another state. There is something we do also need to make sure that we're not knowingly allowing our territory to be used, and there is a norm about that, and I think there is more to be said about how we can drill down on that and expand on those issues that Eric was talking about. But that is, I think, a question of understanding the implementation and operationalization of existing norms. And I'm really happy if others have norms that they think we need to have a discussion about how I would fit them under existing norms. Or, and I know, Andres, this is not a conversation about international law, but in many respects you can't separate the two. They are complementary. And if I can't fit it under a norm, I can fit it under existing international law. So, there is, in my respect, my opinion, I'm yet to come across an issue that is a genuine gap. If someone can find one, I'm very willing to have a conversation about whether or not we need to expand that. But I just haven't yet in my 5.5 years of looking at these issues very deeply. And so really this comes to a question for me of intent and actually not just having the rhetoric around this, but actually, are we going to do what we say that we have said we are going to do? And I think that is much more where there is a lot of work to be done. And I would say that if there are areas where we do need to have much stronger agreements, the reality is we need countries to agree to that. And at the moment, in my view, the P5 are simply not motivated to agree to activities that will constrain their behaviour further, because they don't have trust, and they don't have trust that their counterparts will equally constrain their behaviour. And until they can either trust or verify that their partner, that our, we can use the term adversaries if you like, are also going to constrain their behaviour, I do not believe that we will have meaningful progression in this space. And so I think this question of trust and verification is a really important one if we are committed genuinely to making progress in this space. Trust, obviously, confidence building measures is a big part of that, and I know you have a session on that later today. And verification, I think there's a huge role for the private sector. And I should say verification is not the same as attribution. Verification is being able to say, we commit not to cause damage to another country's critical infrastructure. We commit, for example, hypothetically, not to pre-position on the infrastructure of another country, unless we have the capability to verify that others are also not pre-positioning on our infrastructure. I just don't think we're going to get to a point where countries will agree to that. So that's a very practical aspect, but that doesn't mean there's not a lot that we can be doing now. And I think that's really about implementing those norms, and it's also about deepening understanding of the application of international law as well. And by doing that, we're identifying the gaps so that when we are in a position that we have the trust, that we either trust or verification or both, then we can move forward quickly. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, and a lot of that sits around the trust and verification piece. Thanks.
Thanks, Rana. This gaps will emerge through implementation is very interesting. I never heard that. That's good. Great, thank you. Natalie, would you like to elaborate on that as well? If you have any thoughts on potential new norms, thank you.
Certainly. Well, in principle, the Netherlands is not against new norms. However, we are considerate, as Joanna also eloquently pointed out, that there is this careful balance achieved in elaborating the existing norms by consensus. And in part, this is also why the GG decided to elaborate an additional layer of understanding to these norms, giving them more clarity and depth. And if in the future we commonly identify gaps in the existing norms and are able to find consensus around how to address them, then we are open to that. But I very much like to echo what Joanna just said about trust and verification. That is indeed key. We also believe that over the years the norms have maintained their relevance because they are technology neutral. That's also essential. Also to pick up on the on 2 points that Joanna and Eric made, I think indeed norms and international law need to be considered as one framework. We never sort of in our national system only talk about the norms. We always call it the normative framework, meaning international law and the norms. And indeed, when we then talk about operationalizing them, as Eric was also pointing out, I fully agree with the element on, well, we call it due diligence in international law, where we actually see it as an obligation that if another country points out to us that they are being targeted through a server in the Netherlands, that it is actually our obligation to look at that and to see whether within the context of our own national legislation, we would be able to actually take action to stop that attack. And it's these kind of forms of operationalizing that are very relevant. And that is what I also mean with sort of building the right frameworks in order to be able to operationalize it at the global level. Meanwhile, of course, we can also, in the new open-ended working group, showcase the operationalizing that has already happened in different regions of the world, in different countries, in other initiatives. And I think that would make the discussion in the open-ended working group richer, and like the governments that are around the table can actually learn from that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll have a question about due diligence and the one framework in a second, but I'd like to give Eric first an opportunity to chip in as well. Eric, I know you sort of started touching upon these new norms question already, but if you have anything additional, that would be great. Thank you.
First of all, I wanted to thank Joanna for clarifying for me the relationship between the two reports. I think it's really useful to hear that. And also having heard that someone as expert as Joanna has spent 5 years looking for new norms and hasn't found one, would lead me to conclude that it would be foolish for me to suggest that there should be a new norm. So I think I think that it would be more productive for me to try to think about this in the way that you have phrased it, which is to say look for opportunities to nest ideas within existing norms. And with that in mind, I would point to the norm that's in I think it's paragraph 28 of the chair's summary. It says, seek to prevent proliferation of malicious ICT tools and techniques and the use of harmful hidden functions, and encourage responsible reporting of vulnerabilities. And I do think that there are a couple of opportunities there for evolution over time with regard to that particular norm. First, I would say that I would think about expanding the norm or evolving it to clarify that governments that handle vulnerabilities should have a clear process that relates to favoring disclosure of the vulnerabilities that they come across. So the idea of reporting sounds like it's encouraging the governments to receive, or for vendors who are developing technology to receive and then to use vulnerability information. But there is a discrete area of work that relates to what we call vulnerabilities equities processes, whereby governments that receive information about vulnerabilities have to make a decision about whether to hang on to that information or to turn it back over to the vendor. We've seen a number of examples of governments that have developed a proactive policy that requires them to do this weighing process and then to favor disclosing the information back to the vendors. The United States, the UK, Canada, and then if you look in the Australia, and if you look in the recently announced platform for the new ruling party in Germany, that they have information there that indicates that this is something that they care about as well too. And so I would love to see that adopted as a normative goal for governments to move in that direction. And then also, I think part and parcel of that is the idea that these processes actually have to be maintained inside the government. So where you have private sector markets that allow for buying and selling of the vulnerabilities, and then governments can leverage those markets, it can allow for escape from the processes that governments would otherwise find themselves beholden to. So we've seen an example in the U.S. where the FBI was asked about whether or not it had leveraged the process that the U.S. government was, and if it turns out that the government can essentially hire a private sector company to do the work, then it may escape the weighing process that would otherwise normally be required. And then secondly, I would say under that same bullet point of vulnerability reporting, that we have seen examples, at least of one country, where there is a proposal to require vulnerability disclosure reporting within a firm deadline, and that can potentially create asymmetries of information between competing or rival nations, and so that would be highly concerning. And the processes that we esse at Cisco, and I think that would be commonly used by those who adhere to the ISO standards for vulnerability handling and reporting, essentially require that you tell everybody all at once. We announce to the world. We don't tell one government over another. And so if you had a rule or a regulation or a law in certain countries but not in others that would require fixed deadlines that are not in alignment with each other, you could potentially result in those asymmetries. And so evolving the norm to try to eliminate that as a possibility, I think, would be useful too.
That's a really good point. I like that a lot. Before we move on to multi-stakeholder structure or aspect of the norm setting and norm elaborating, I'd like to ask a related question to new norms and changing rules. Are we going to see, or do we, so instead of perhaps new norms, are we going to see some new categories, or no, sorry, certain norms shifting the categories? Due diligence reminded me here, Natalie, thank you for mentioning that. I know that one of the governments did raise this issue during the OEWG and said that this should in fact be discussed under the international law section. I think, Joanna, you have some opinion about that as well. But whoever wants to jump in on that. But are we going to see not necessarily due diligence, but any of the norms to be recategorized to the international law and perhaps molded a bit? Is that a possibility as well? Should that occur as well during the next OEWG?
I think there are just a couple of levels to answer your question. I think there should, first of all, be an understanding on, as Joanna put it, the intent of countries. So we have been vocal on encouraging countries to actually be more transparent on their interpretation of international law, including the due diligence principle. But then also it is crucial that countries are transparent on their intent around the norms that are, of course, logically coming from international law. And what is really worrying is that certain countries are now saying, yeah, they're only voluntary. So what do they mean? Well, the norms clearly show a certain commitment by governments. So it is not that they are not meaningful in any way. So that's sort of at that higher level of sort of being transparent on the intent, and that would, I think, create a better understanding among the international community of the intentions by governments. That having said, I mean, when we talk about the norm or due diligence in international law, the whole idea behind it is that when you start to operationalize this, that when I'm from one government, and I actually represent a certain government, and I ask another government, hey, I see this attack coming from your soil, and it is actually aiming us. Can you do something about it? I want them to have certain procedures to actually address that. And I want to be reassured that they are actually capable of taking action. So also here, capacity building is really crucial for certain countries. And so sort of coming to a better understanding of what do you expect from another country when you actually address them on an attack coming from their soil is something that is, I think, completely in line with international law and the norms.
Thank you, Natalie. Yes, Joanna, please go ahead.
I would just add a couple of points. I think on the points that Eric raised about supply chain and the private sector was interesting. So norm 13J is the norm that talks about both supply chain and harmful hidden functions, vulnerabilities, etc. And it was interesting that in a lot of the discussions, because supply chain has been so controversial, actually a lot of the in-depth discussions focused on supply chain, not so much on the vulnerabilities. We do talk about the role of the private sector and hint at some of the things that Eric raised, and I think they're really areas that are ripe for further development of understandings on those issues. When it comes to the question of the evolution of norms to international law, of course, a number of these norms actually directly refer to international law. So you should not act contrary to international law by damaging the critical infrastructure of another state, for example, or the due diligence norm, as it's often called, talks about you should not allow internationally wrongful acts to be committed from your territory. And of course, an internationally wrongful act is a very specific legal term. So I think there is definitely scope that some of these norms may evolve. I'm not sure that there is the appetite, frankly, of all UN member states for them to evolve in the time period of the new OEWG. The due diligence norm, for example, there was a long discussion in both the GG and the OEWG about inserting the word due diligence. You know, we all colloquially refer to that norm as the due diligence norm, but getting those words into the report, there were a number of countries who said, no, we don't recognize this as an international legal obligation. And this really comes back to, if we are going to evolve the norms into law, it has to be with the agreement of every UN state. That's the way the UN functions, right? And it is not something that I currently see countries committed to seeing that evolution. It's also why, and I'm sorry, Andres, to keep talking about international law in the wrong panel, but it's also why I'm deeply skeptical when you have countries who talk about we need new conventions, we need new treaties, because I just don't think that we will be able to negotiate meaningful outcomes in the current environment unless we deal with verification and trust. So yes, I think there's definitely scope, but I'm not currently seeing appetite on behalf of the countries that matter. And I'm meaning here in terms of walking the walk rather than talking the talk.
Thanks. I'd love to continue the discussion. I'm personally very interested in this topic as well. But I'm afraid we're going to have to move on and save some time also for the questions at the end from the audience. I would like to move in now to the multi-stakeholder aspect, as I announced already before. During the past OEWG, some states recognized the value of partnerships with the private sector on the implementation of norms, but also some noted the importance of outreach and cooperation to ensure that various stakeholders, including the private sector, uphold their responsibility in the use of ICTs. But I want to explore the aspect of, as I said, the norm setting and norm perhaps elaborating. How can the private sector meaningfully contribute to the norm setting process, namely now OEWG? How can an industry and other non-state actors contribute to the development of these existing norms, or perhaps reshuffling, or whatever changes that we will see in the normative framework? So obviously, Eric, I'd like you to start with that, but I welcome Joanna's and Natalie's comments on this particular topic as well. Please, I kindly ask you to be short if possible. We have a number of questions that need to be answered from the audience. One is particularly about accountability, so I guess we're going to explore these issues as well. But first, role of norm in the norm setting and norm molding, I suppose, process. Thank you.
Great. So as I mentioned before, many of us in the private sector have been doing some important work on establishing areas where we are articulating our own norms of behavior. And that if you look at those, I believe that they clearly reflect a desire to see parallel norms adopted or evolved among governments. I would point you to the work of the Cyber Tech Accord, which led a working group 3 under the Paris Call, that was specifically aimed at studying multi-stakeholder input for UN dialogues on cyber. And the study was the result of a 6-month process of engagement and discussions within that working group. And it makes the case for enhanced collaboration across stakeholder groups, providing a set of recommendations on ways to ensure greater inclusivity in UN dialogues on cybersecurity. The Cyber Tech Accord, which again, Cisco is a founding member of, states that says that states should develop processes that consider input from the ICT industry and civil society in determining positions and approaches that touch on their areas of interest and help the governments leverage prominent industry and non-state actors. Specifically, the working group report talks about the importance of making sure that multi-stakeholder inclusion in cybersecurity dialogues are designed so that they are well structured, to ensure that there is a constructive and properly received process to engage, that there's regular engagement to allow for a dialogue back and forth, and that it's systemic rather than being ad hoc to ensure robust participation. So I'll just leave it there because I know we're short on time, but those are the high-level points, and then I would point you again to that Cyber Tech Accord report under the Paris Call for further detail about advice on participation in cyber dialogues by private sector actors. But again, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to participate in this forum leading into the OEWG group, because I think it was an important sign about the need for industry engagement and private sector engagement.
Natalie, if you want to go first, and then Joanna, please, on this particular issue as well. Thank you.
Well, states have, of course, the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We do share the perspective that the multi-stakeholder engagement is pivotal. I mean, we all know that more than, I think, 95% of the internet is actually owned by others than governments. We also believe that multi-stakeholders are essential to the open-ended working group process as the topic of discussions we engage in also impact aspects that are run by multi-stakeholders. And we also believe that states should preserve the multi-stakeholder model that has made the internet so successful. And we feel that the international community should be working on implementation of the normative framework, ideally via the proposed program of action that helps states via capacity building and international cooperation. But without the other stakeholders outside of governments, that is impossible. The current multi-stakeholder aspects of the open-ended working group are, however, debatable. The previous open-ended working group set out to allow meaningful and substantive inputs, including from non-ECOSOC accredited NGOs. The problem, however, was that objections were made to all NGOs that expressed interest, which caused the procedure to be ineffective in what it sought to achieve. And that is the reason we would like to revise the procedure for this process. And even though we fully respect the chair's approach, we have been proposing to the chair to enhance the transparency by encouraging states to make known their objections to all delegations. And we believe that transparency in decision making is something that is very important and has a broader impact on the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Yeah, I took note of all these things. Joanna, if you want to weigh in, and then I'll start with some questions. Thank you.
I wanted to begin by acknowledging the excellent work of the Tech Accord companies. I think they really have led the way. There are now a number of other initiatives, but Tech Accord was definitely one of the first that was really stood up and also put forward meaningful norms. So I think that's a really important contribution. In terms of the role of the multi-stakeholder community, but particularly industry, I would say the first step is to engage. We need more industry in the room. We need more industry to be sharing your views. And I couldn't agree more with Natalie's point about ECOSOC, because most industry are not members of an ECOSOC accredited NGO. So we need to provide a way for industry to meaningfully engage in the OEWG conversations. And certainly my new centre, the Tech Policy Design Centre, is supporting a number of initiatives calling for greater multi-stakeholder participation in the OEWG process. One point that I often make, though, is notwithstanding the fact that we will push as hard as we possibly can to get the voices in the room of the multi-stakeholder community, as I and many others, especially the state representatives, will know, a lot of the real hard work when it comes to these types of negotiations doesn't happen in the formal meetings. And so industry, I would also encourage you to engage outside of those formal meetings as well. And the point that I would make here is to really make an effort to understand the negotiating dynamics. You know, I think a good example on this is things like a convention in this space. There are a number of industry counterparts who call for a convention, and frankly, if I could draft a convention and know that countries were going to, that it would be a convention that would have meaningful restraints that countries would follow, then sure, I would be open to that. But that is not the negotiating reality that we're dealing with, and so the real risk is that if we were to open that up, that we would end up with less protections than we have now. And I think that's a really important driver to understand, but then also for industry to come and help from a solutions perspective, because one of the biggest barriers to getting to a point where we can have those meaningful constraints is the verification issue. And I do think industry is probably the one that is most likely to come up with the scenario. In fact, I'd put 90% odds that a verification solution will come from industry, not from government. So, if we deal with that verification piece, then we're going to be able to make substantial progress in terms of other areas. So immense amounts. And I would say it's also incumbent on governments to engage with industry. So this was something that we did when I was the head of delegation for Australia quite extensively, but there aren't actually a lot of countries who do that in a meaningful way. So in the same way that I would say industry step up, I would also say to governments, you need to step up and draw on the expertise that these industry partners bring, because it really is an important perspective to contributing to international peace and stability for all of us.
Thank you. Some very well framed conceptual and practical answers as well. I'm really glad, and again, happy to have Eric here to weigh in today. I'll start with some questions. Unfortunately, a failure on my end as a moderator. Have not saved enough time for the questions from the audience, but nonetheless, let's try to address at least some. One of the questions that I sort of announced at the beginning already was the question from Goda. What is being done for accountability of non-state actors hired by state actors to conduct cyber operations as part of active defense or persistent engagement, whatever this concept is named? I guess we're all familiar. So whoever wants to jump in, I know, Eric, you perhaps are going to have something to say on that particular issue. We touched upon that yesterday already during our preparatory call.
So yeah, again, as I noted before, I do think that this is an important area where there's an intersection between the public sector and the private sector, and allowing for private sector markets to operate where governments can acquire vulnerabilities is something that I would think that government should be concerned about, as given the focus on trying to protect critical infrastructure, healthcare systems, supply chain systems, and things like that. So, but I believe we touched upon it already, though.
Thank you. Yes, but this time we're talking about the issue from a slightly different perspective. We're talking about the accountability of these non-state actors, and obviously, of course, the role of the government in constraining that.
I can contribute a couple of points. The first thing I would note is that terminology that's being used there in terms of persistent engagement, active defense. You know, it's terminology that's often used, for example, by the US authorities. And the first point, of course, would be that I'm sure if you had a US official here, they would say that that policy is not contrary to international law, that they are acting within the legal authorization. So, but I think what the point of this is, if you have private sector actors who are acting outside of the law, what are we doing to constrain that behaviour? And to that, I would point to the norm about non-intervention, the norm about not allowing internationally wrongful acts to be occurring from your territory, the norm on with respect to vulnerabilities. But I do think there is a lot more to be said to strengthen the understanding of the obligations of countries around this. And it's something that you're starting to see coming out in a lot of the high level statements. So when Biden was making statements about some of the recent public attributions that they've made against with respect to both behaviour by Russia and China, there was statements here referencing this norm and the obligation that it's not okay to say this is just people acting from your territory, that you as a state actually have to take action to ensure that this type of activity is not emanating from your territory if it's activity that contravenes international law. So I think you are seeing increasing appetite to address this. You've seen the EU taking action against some of the vulnerability export companies as well. So we are seeing more activity in this space, but it's certainly an area where we need to have more depth around the provisions of these norms, but also international law, right? This is, again, it's not just about norms. If people are violating principles like sovereignty or the principle of non-intervention, the right to recourse, the accountability function doesn't come from the norms, it comes from our existing international legal provisions. And it's about having countries use those provisions to hold non-state actors accountable. And I'd also point to the fact that one of the norms is around not allowing criminal behaviour from your territory, and a lot of the type of activity that is happening, this activity would be classed as criminal behaviour, and the norm is about we should cooperate to prevent this type of behaviour. This is what I mean by the norms and the international law exists. We need to implement it. We need to operationalise it. And we need to work together to ensure that we're actually doing it. Just because it's not working doesn't mean that it's because of a lack of law or norms, it's a lack of motivation rather than in existence of those provisions that apply.
Thank you, Joanna. Nathalie, please.
I fully endorse what was just been said. I'd just like to add one word, and that is also here, verification would help enormously. Thanks.
The fact that you were so short is going to be, I think, very much appreciated by the audience here, because we're scheduled to go for lunch now. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much, Ambassador Jasma. And thank you, Eric, for joining us to this panel. Thanks to all the online audience as well. This concludes this particular panel, and next one we'll be discussing the international law. So the ones of everyone that is itching to start discussing these things as well, more than welcome to join the next panel as well. Thank you again.